As a starting point, I would say that geographers normally start from concrete conflicts and try perhaps then to integrate these conflicts in, or to frame these conflicts in overall configurations. And that's what I'm doing with this first question mark here, how we can and how we have to frame our research in several and very different overall discourses on global change or on the Anthropocene, discourses which come more from the natural sciences, or discourses about growth, development versus post-growth, post-development, or about perspectives from the north, from the south. I will give no answer to that. This is really only a question mark, and I will try to structure my considerations in 8 theses or 8 arguments, and I hope that this will help a little bit for me and for you to understand what I would like to, what would be my message here. So, in certain aspects I can be very brief because Maristella Svampa elaborated much more some points which I would like to stress as well, and so I perhaps will only add some observations. So this is the case for instance, for the first thesis that globalization and reprimarization of Latin American economies are absolutely interlinked. One observation which I think is important in that sense is that there is, in several cases, in my perspective, relatively complicated paradox, because for several products, for instance, such as strategic minerals and so, we have to consider a paradox, which is that in the interest of global sustainability, non-sustainable conditions of extraction and production in those areas where those products come from are accepted. And this is, I think, a very important or a situation which you will find in several regions, especially in Latin America, but certainly in other regions of the world as well. A second thesis is to say that globalized extraction or production of mineral and agricultural resources implies, in my opinion, following my research, new actor constellations and new forms of conflicts. So, Maristella Svampa mentioned the raising importance of transnational companies, for instance. I will give you some examples later on. But I think that we have to consider that for a case of Latin America, for instance, Latin American companies themselves become transnational actors as well. So this is, for instance, the case of the Brazilian company Vale, which you certainly know, or for Petrobras and other ones. And this certainly gives a new face to those constellations where we have to look at the interests, at logics of action, and it gives perhaps a new connotation to power relations, etc. At this point, I would like to interrupt a little bit my 8 arguments, and I would like to integrate 2 short case studies which are interlinked. And the first case study is, I think, one probably of the most emblematic cases of a resource frontier, which is the case of Amazonia. When you look at Amazonia, then you will see that the situation to be a resource frontier is nothing new. That is something which is a situation which Amazonia lives since the end of the 19th century, at least, starting with the rubber extraction and then going in the 70s to a situation of exploring land by peasants, by colonization, using Amazonia as a periphery where the social problems of the rest of the country could be solved, what was an extremely important mistake, as you all know. But when we look at Amazonia today, then we have, first of all, the situation that globalization changes the position of different actors, improves or increases the importance of mining, of energy production, or more specifically, and that is what I would like to develop further on, integrates this region in the production of global goods like products of agrobusiness and others. And as Maristela Swampa mentioned, 2008, 2007 is in a certain sense a shift in the politics and what resources are concerned. And in Brazil, this is linked to the declaration and the beginning of the so-called PAC programs, Plano de Aceleração do Crescimento, which can be considered as a huge infrastructure investment program and which deepens the existing conflicts over resources in that region in order of, on the one hand, strengthening a policy of modernization and incorporation of that area. And on the other hand, you have, since the beginning of the 90s, at least in the discourses, a shift towards sustainability orientation. So this contradiction is, until today, in my opinion, one of the most important contradictions in policies on resources, and so in the Brazilian case and in Amazonia. So let's go to a second case study, which takes us a little bit more to the south, to the Cerrado areas, so that means the savanna areas in Brazil, where we can observe what we can call mar de soja, an ocean of soybean, which is now dominating the biggest part of the central areas of South America. And especially in this case, we can see how new actor constellations or old actor constellations change, new actor constellations emerge, and what this means. So we can, in order of new forms of production, introduction of new crops, we can observe a very strong concentration process. We can observe a concentration process in big transnational companies, the big four, which are not only important for Brazil but for Argentina as well. We can observe new forms of investment, as for instance the so-called pools de siembra and others. We can observe new forms of land renting, which formerly did not exist in that extent in those areas, and we can especially observe new tendencies openly or more secretly of land grabbing, not only from in a very global scale, but in a regional scale as well, between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia as well. And what I found very interesting is that we can observe once again a new constellation which is the export of such a model to other areas. 2 years ago, the Ministry of Agriculture of Mozambique came to Mato Grosso and incentive or calling the Mato Grosso farmer organizations to engage in Mozambique, because he found that the development, so-called development model of agribusiness in Mato Grosso is so successful that he would like to reproduce it in its own country. So what would be my third thesis is, and perhaps these examples showed that a little bit, that the growing integration of Latin America into globalized commodity chains, and soybean is a very good example for such globalized commodity chains, does not only lead to ecological but also and primarily to socioeconomic vulnerabilities. It leads to an increase of dependencies, and it leads to an increase of external control of regional development. And as I said before, geographers look always to scales, they look to places, to regions and so on. And I would say at the first glance, resource conflicts, and that is my fourth thesis, are always embedded locally and regionally, but they transcend simultaneously scales. And this constitutes a new challenge for us, theoretically, methodologically, from the understanding of this situation. So we have to apply a multiscalar perspective to understand how resource conflicts work today, and we have to consider that for eventual forms of solution. A fifth thesis continues with that idea, and I would like to quote that at the local, regional scale, new modes of resource extraction, which Maristela Swampa explained very well, very excellently, result in changing and in very oftenly in conflicting territorialities. So this means that we can observe in a lot of cases, so the superposition of different logics which determine in a certain way territorialities. And those different territorialities, they come in conflict, and then processes of displacement and successions of territorialities in let's say a sequence of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, now I got it, happen. So I think that the idea of conflicting territorialities is a very important one to look at socio-spatial configurations and what aspects those socio-spatial configurations determine. A sixth thesis goes to another scale, goes to a higher scale, and what I would say is that one of the main dilemmas in Latin America today consists in a contradiction between the orientation towards modernization and growth on the one hand, and sustainability on the other. And this is the case in Brazil, for instance, when you look at the global at the political discourses, but when you look at very concrete political issues as well. So when on the one hand, you have programs like the IRSA program, which is a huge infrastructure plan for South American integration, when you look at the two PAC programs, which I mentioned. But on the other hand, you have a lot of initiatives for environmental governance. You have a lot of initiatives, especially in the Amazonian case, looking at new politics of land regulation, looking at new politics of environmental certification, like the so-called Cadastro Ambiental Rural, and other issues. So there is a certain contradiction in that, but we have to see that the modernization discourse becomes more and more important and becomes the dominant discourse again. But even though in the face of those mentioned challenges of resource extraction in Latin America, the Latin American civil society, and Maristella mentioned that as well, has developed new pathways to tackle inequalities and deal with conflict constellations. And this, I think, is a point where we should ask if we can learn something from the Latin American experience, and I would let this question open. And my last thesis, coming perhaps more to a scientific point from a global perspective, questions of inequality on the one hand and fairness, justice on the other, gain and have to gain importance. And I think we have to look to the concepts we use, concepts as Ecologia Social, soziale Ökologie, environmental justice, or political ecology, what can be their contribution to a better understanding of these conflicts and perhaps contribute to new pathways towards solution as well. Thank you very much.